Start recording.
So there we go. Okay. All right. Good evening, Lower Hudson Valley chapter members. Thank you for joining us for today's political education session, the railways and capitalism, socialist critique. We're going to be going over the not recent, but the spotlight, I guess, the national spotlight on our national rail crisis, why it is the way it is. Speaking of rail, folks, don't you love living near a freight train? Don't you love it? The 806 never misses Congress. Okay, so we'll get started. What is it? We have some recent train derailments in the news. I'm sure most people are familiar with East Palestine. As well, there was also a train carrying coal that derailed in, I believe it's Gothenburg, Nebraska. There was a chemical bearing train that went off the rails near Detroit, which was operated by the same Norfolk Southern company that was behind the East Palestine crash. I had this written as more recently a propane-filled car flipped over in a Florida derailment, which was recent up until this morning when a Norfolk Southern train derailed in Alabama during the CEO's congressional testimony and congressional apology for the crash in East Palestine. So if there are this many crashes with our trains, we can, I guess, assume that train derailments are like bad weather. There's nothing you can do about them. This is just something that happens, except that that's not really the case. For 2019, the U.S. logged 1,338 train derailments on 770 million train kilometers, so millions of train kilometers. In Europe, where there's almost 6 times as much train kilometers, there's 4.5 billion train kilometers, almost 6 times as much as in the US, and yet there's only 73 derailments in Europe for 2019. In Japan, there's 2 billion train kilometers, only 9 derailments. So we can see that there are places with many magnitudes more, or not magnitudes, but many times more train kilometers, and yet a small fraction of the total train derailments that's occurring in the US. So why is this happening? The short answer is profit seeking. What we're witnessing is the result of a decades-long effort to move as much weight as possible on trains as long as possible with as little staff as possible to respond to emergencies. While this keeps costs down and maximizes the efficiency of moving freight, it puts obvious physical strain on our rail system and not as obvious stress on our railway workers. I don't know if everyone had a chance to read the piece in Solidarity by Mr. Bartlett, but we're going to go into some of the working conditions of the railway workers and what was missed in the fight for, or the framing of last year's fight for sick days. So the method of, I guess, railway work is called precision scheduled railroading. This is a process that's instituted by the rail companies, which includes cost-cutting measures and a just-in-time approach that translates to more train cars, heavier loads, and fewer workers. Rail carriers have slashed their workforce recently. Collectively, Class 1 carriers reduced theirs by almost 1/3 over the past 6 years, which has made them the darlings of Wall Street, as increased operating ratios lead to more money for shareholders. To get to the bottom of the bottom line, in the literal sense, Norfolk Southern reduced its workforce by 1/3 between 2002 and 2022. In that same period, it doubled its profits. In 2022, the company reported record operating profits of $4.8 billion. Earlier that year, it announced a $10 billion stock buyback program. So in other words, they are trying to keep costs as low as possible, minimal staff, putting as much pressure on each individual train, sometimes as long as 2 miles long for each train, adding more and more cars with heavier and heavier freight. And this is what's leading to the stresses that we're seeing on our rail infrastructure today. Less obvious, because it's not as widely covered, is the stress that it's putting on railway workers. Rail carriers downsizing of their workforce means that those who remain are tied to work at almost all times, as we saw in the fight in September through December last year. No sick days. They also have unpredictable schedules, and they're suffering from overwork. In the solidarity piece, Bartlett outlines that while press coverage of the potential strike last year focused on the issue of no sick days, the inability to have a regular schedule and draconian attendance policies tipped the majority of rail workers to the breaking point. In other words, yes, it's terrible that they don't have any sick days, but what's more, in his mind, more terrible is having to work under these conditions in the first place. Quoting from the piece, in a class of 15, like the one I was in, more than half of the people quit the job within months. It wasn't the dangerous conditions so much that forced people to look for another job. It was the irregular schedule of never knowing when you were going to be called into work. He explains in the piece that they wait until they have a train that's 2 miles long, basically, that's ready to go. And it's only once they have that train ready that they call you and say, okay, time to go to work, which is to say there's very little predictability in setting your work schedule ahead of time. Safety as well. I'm still quoting from Bartlett. There are too many cars per train, no proper balancing of the mass of the train proportionally, and a reduction in time to inspect each car, leading to failure to bad order a car and remove it from the train until it's fixed. There's an economic reason for that, a profit-driven reason for that. 7 years ago, Norfolk Southern management recommended that inspectors spend no more than 2.5 minutes per car. That time limit has been reduced to 90 seconds today to reduce what's known as dwell time, during which the car is unproductive to the rail company. In other words, a car that's being inspected for safety issues is a car that's not being loaded with freight. And if a train is not being loaded with freight, it is not being used productively from the POV of the rail company. So let's take a look at those rail companies. There are 4 of them. They're basically similar to like cable companies. They have their own like regional monopoly. I would say like Union Pacific and BNSF operate west of Chicago onto the West Coast. CSX, the Northeast, and Norfolk Southern as well, east of Chicago. Norfolk Southern, the one that's most famous in the news because of the East Palestine derailment, had 11 billion in revenue, which translates to about 4 billion in profits. Union Pacific, 21.8 billion in revenue, 6 billion in profits. CSX, 12.5 billion in revenue, 3.8 in profits. BNSF, 23.3 billion in revenue, 6.5 billion in profits. This was a major sticking point over the fight for sick days last year. It's not like these guys don't have the money for the sick days. They just don't want to provide that cushion for their labor force because that eats into their profits. And to the delight of Wall Street, the average profit margins of the top 5 U.S. railroads have roughly doubled in the past 15 years. So the profits that are being generated by the rail companies are being paid to dividends, stock buybacks, et cetera, which enhances the value of the company and rewards the investors who buy their stock. There's also a political reason why it's taken so long for our political system to respond to the crashes that do happen. Norfolk Southern and its political action committee have donated more than $20,000 directly to Ohio Governor DeWine's gubernatorial campaigns, as well as his 2019 inauguration. The company has also delivered $165,000 to political committees supporting DeWine's political career, including the Republican Governors Association and the Republican Attorneys General Association. They also have a lobbyist outfit. I love the name of this. It's called the Success Group, which I love very much as a name for a nefarious lobbyist organization. They've been successful in greasing the wheels for a proposed $1.6 billion sale of the city of Cincinnati's publicly owned railroad to Norfolk Southern. In other words, they're proposing, it seems right now the city of Cincinnati owns what they value at $1.6 billion worth of railroad that Norfolk Southern is attempting to purchase from the city of Cincinnati. And there's actually a Republican official, I don't know whether it's which part of the state legislature it is, but who said that he did the math and there's almost no way that Cincinnati continuing to own and lease their railroad is less profitable than whatever one-time sale of their railroad would generate. So it doesn't even make economic sense for the city of Cincinnati. I'll keep this one short because I know there was some discussion in the Poli Ed planning session for this discussion on what we can do, because I know that people will have their own perspectives and ideas, but just wanted to highlight two calls to action. There have been calls to remove the ravenous profit motive from the current system altogether by nationalizing the railways, put it under state ownership or public ownership. On October 5th, 2022, Rail Workers United adopted a resolution calling for public ownership of railroad infrastructure, which is operated for the public benefit. As well, the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America recently issued a call for public ownership of railroads to protect the economy, workers, frontline communities, and the environment. This was highlighted in the in these Times piece. It was very long. I think it's somewhere in the bottom of the first third of the piece. It's where you can find it. So that's everything for right now. That went much quicker than I anticipated. What are people's thoughts, comments, concerns, etc.? Martin, I know you had some thoughts on nationalization in the planning session. Yeah.
First, before I comment, let me just ask, who prepared these slides?
I did.
Bravo. They're really first rate.
Oh, thank you.
They're good. They're good. I tried to contact the Port Authority, and they have a very bizarre system. They don't post a public relations office or any number that you can call. I'll continue to try to see if they have a person in-house who has the right expertise who we could use as a sounding board or to field questions. And if the Port Authority doesn't have it, I guess the FRA might, but locally, I can't think of anyone beside the Port Authority. I read not all of the In These Times piece. I guess it's
very long. It's easily the longest of the bunch. Yeah.
And it seems to me it's ambiguous about whether we're nationalizing the entire railroad company and / operation versus just the rail bed. They're both in there.
Mm-hmm.
The distinction between the two is huge. Okay, and I think that the In These Times article zigzags back and forth without making that clear. Basically, the nationalizing the roadbed and the tracks would put it on an equivalent of the interstates. Okay, and then just as any trucking company that's properly licensed can access the interstate, any railroad company that was properly licensed could access the interstate, and it would end the kind of local monopoly where one of the big railroads has the only access to a particular city or an industrial park or that kind of thing. And they can turn, the big railroad companies turn around to the shippers, who can be substantial sized companies in their own right, and say to them, these are our terms, take it or leave it. Okay, if you had the rail highway, a medium-sized firm, a small firm, a new firm could go to the same shipper and say, we'd like your business and give us a try. And we'll be here on Monday morning if you tell us so. So by owning the right of way, these four huge railroad companies establish a monopoly locally, even though there's four of them and there are medium-sized railroad companies too. If your particular industrial park or industrial facility does not have access to multiple lines, then you're facing a monopoly, because they've got the only access into your industrial facility. So the nationalizing the right of way would end that. Then, nationalizing the entire railroad operation would also end that, but you would have the federal government or some kind of board that it appointed, some kind of something like the Tennessee Valley Authority, some kind of authority, running these very, very, very complicated actual freight transport operations. So they're very different from each other. And I think we need to bear that in mind.
Steve, you're on stack.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I agree. I think that was really, really good, very comprehensive. Just first, a couple questions and then a couple comments. So, do you know, thinking about the slide where it compared derailments in the U.S. with the EU and Japan?
Right, yeah.
Do you know if the railroads in the EU and Japan are state-owned or are private companies?
I know that it varies. They had a list in These Times article about the countries that have national or even quasi-national systems. That I don't know. I can't say for certain that every country in the EU is a national system. I'm not sure about Japan. The only thing I would take from this is, even if there are private companies operating here, they are probably not using the precision scheduled railroading if they're getting different results from us. That's the only thing I could say, to you for certain, on a pretty good guess.
Right. Yeah, I understand. Okay. And with the Cincinnati publicly owned railroad, I'm assuming that that's the tracks they're talking about. That Cincinnati does not operate freight cars. Is that right?
Right. It's the lines themselves. Okay. That's my understanding.
Right.
And they lease it out.
That's a good thing. That's a very interesting local approach.
I think people might just be interested in a little note of comparison. As you know, I worked in the subway in New York for years, and I was just stunned by this figure about Norfolk Southern Standard is 90 seconds to inspect a rail car.
Yeah.
In the Transit Authority, when we're inspecting a train to put it into service, depending on the kind of equipment, we're given between 45 minutes and an hour to inspect a 10-car train. You can do it in less time, but you're allotted that amount of time to do a thorough inspection. And so this is just staggering that, by Norfolk Southern standards, 10-car train, 90 seconds, it would be 15 minutes to check out a train as opposed to 3 to 4 times that. Right. So I'm getting back to this question of the ownership of the tracks or nationalizing the railroad that you raised and that Martin was talking about. It sounds like, from what you presented, the RWU's position is you presented it as public ownership of the railroad infrastructure, which to me means public ownership of the right of way, the rail, the lines, the lines, the signals, switches, not the rolling stock.
Right.
And the UE is calling for public ownership of everything, nationalizing the railroads, public ownership of the rolling stock. Just off the, without obviously seeing any proposals or anything off the top of my head, this whole argument that, wait, back up. So in 1970s, Carter deregulated interstate trucking, and deregulated the railroads as well. for that matter, which is one of the things that led to this sort of drive for profit maximization and the precision railroad scheduling. And this analogy that you made, Martin, between treating the tracks as if they were like interstate highways and anybody can use them. It was a disaster for interstate trucking and for the Teamsters in that industry, and for truckers themselves. There's been the standards in the industry have been driven way down in the 50 years since. And I think that there's a big difference between deregulating interstate trucking, which I think we should, which I think we would have opposed then, and I think worked out very badly. But it's you can sort of picture somebody, buying or leasing a truck or two, and then going into business and offering their services to the shippers and creating competition. I can't picture somebody leasing a train or two to offer their services to the shippers. There's no valid comparison to sort of say there could be an upstart small business railroad coming onto the scene in an environment just because the tracks have been the roadbed has been nationalized. I think it's not going to make the change, I think, that you were suggesting, Martin.
I agree. The way the trains would actually be operated would have to be, you'd have to do a deep dive on that. Okay, I agree with you about the deregulation. One of the things they did was to replace unionized Teamster drivers with owner operators, and each owner operator owned a small business and purchased or leased his rig, the actual cab, and the results were declining rates of net pay. In other words, when the owner operator was done paying for all the expenses, they weren't earning real income that was anything close to what the Teamsters were previously earning. So you saw the standard of living of truckers decline sharply. Okay, that was Jimmy Carter's deregulation. Thank you very much. And there were companies, finance companies, that specialized in gaming the system. So I agree with you that just nationalizing the right of way, the rails, would not address these other questions. There's also a question of access and scheduling, because in a highway system, the truck just pulls around, other trucks and other traffic. But on a track system, you can't do that. You're queued up behind whoever's ahead of you.
Right. So, which I think is an argument for a full nationalization, not simply taking control of the right of way.
Right. Okay. But there's at least a debate to be had. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that nationalizing at least the right of way, what they call the rail highway, would open up the possibility for drastically improved service by Amtrak, because the passenger service, because the freight operators treat Amtrak like dirt. They never cooperate with Amtrak. And consequently, Amtrak has constraints placed on it. That means that they can't do high-speed rail, real high-speed rail. So if you nationalize the roadbed, if you nationalize the track system, or if you just nationalized everything, you could separate out freight from passenger in such a way that Amtrak would get a big boost. And that's worth pointing out.
Right.
Okay, so the rail highway thing is complicated. But frankly,
I don't think it's that complicated.
Frankly, so is the whole question of nationalizing the railroads. I mean, you're talking about Washington running major industrial operations all over the country. A railroad yard, a sorting yard, a terminal. These are major facilities.
Anyone else with comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, perspectives? We have plenty of time.
Yeah, I was up. I think like a quick
Oh, sorry.
response.
Oh yeah, sorry. Jeremy is on stack, and then Martin, and then
No, I said
Jeff.
what I wanted to say.
Oh, okay. All right. So Jeremy, and then
Don't stack me.
Jeff. Sorry.
Yeah. Originally, I was gonna answer, I think, the question about the EU. I know they're definitely not all state owned. Because I remember from some like labor campaigns. I think it might have been, I don't know if it was Corbyn or some labor campaigns. I think before what's it got to the point where it is now. I remember one thing they had been calling out was like the decline of like the rails and the public trains in the UK under privatization.
Mhm.
But so I know at least some portion of the EU is like privately owned, and it's like suffered as a result.
Yeah, except the UK is not EU anymore.
Oh, right.
Oh yeah, this was as of
No, it's
this was as of
2019.
2019. That was the year that Boris got Brexit done. So actually, technically, this still counts.
Okay. I wonder how many of those derailments were in the UK.
I don't know. I'd have to dig in.
Probably a growing amount if I
Yeah.
had to put money on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I wonder if now the EU numbers look closer to Japan now that the UK is out. That would be interesting to see.
No, that's a good point though about the privatization in the UK.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I had another thought, just like
Mhm.
from the conversation that was happening, just like in terms of like how we like as like socialists are respond to it, like at least at a glance to me, it sounds like go big or go home for us, like nationalize all of it, from like just from my obviously not like experience perspective in this, but from the perspective of like go big or go home. The like not only the right of way, but like the way the private companies themselves operate is catastrophic. So I think for things to really change, I think that level of action is needed, because I remember reading that rail companies, just in terms of like the profit margins, are like like some of the absolute highest of like all types of corporations. They're like very high up there. So like this is like an industry that like absolutely has to be like taken out of private hands. And then just real quick, want to shout out Martin's good point on the Amtrak thing, because that's like a concern. That is like a huge constraint to improving our public transportation as well. It's why like if you look up Amtrak, like it's not uncommon to be stuck for like 2 hours behind one of these giant freight trains because of profit.
That and bureaucratic turf. I mean, there's one case on record where Amtrak took a key stretch of rail in its system and upgraded the surface of the track, the grind the track, align it, do all kinds of good things to it. And later the same day, I forget which line, Norfolk Southern or one of them, rolled a very, very heavy freight train over the newly treated track and ruined it. It didn't even last 24 hours. You know, so it's bureaucratic pissing matches that are going on there as well.
Jeff, you're on stack, and oh, that was a link from Jeremy. So Jeff, you're on stack.
That was also a link from me.
Oh.
Like, yeah, well, UK politics. I was like, that article, I just went through it. It also, I found it interesting. It's a pro nationalization argument, but also tackles like deeper questions in regards to like how exactly like nationalization will actually like affect the efficiency in what ways in regards to countering like natural monopolies. Because yeah, nationalization is actually like a good thing. I do think an aspect that's like missing from a lot of this is how like you need to create awareness about these things within the general public, like awareness and knowledge about like the safety regulations, what they mean, how they affect you outside of the people who just like work within the field itself. Because if you don't, even we assumed like, you know, all the workers within you know, rail lines were like politically homogenous, and I don't think that's the case, and certainly not like in a good way. You need to like as a whole, they by themselves aren't enough to like, you know, like really sway or like push for like power in regards to getting these things implemented on the like electoral level, right? You need like the general public to also be concerned about these things, not just like saying like we need more regulation. You need to actually be like teaching people about like the various concerns and how they matter, and like and be able to like argue for these things themselves, right? You need to create like a intrinsic interest in like safety maintenance as a whole.
Martin, you're on stack.
Yeah, I mean, just some follow-up. You've got these giant corporations now, the big four. You could conceive of a situation, if you had the rail highway, where you had many more medium-sized firms that were still profitable, but you know, not this crazy 20-30% profit rate, and were responsive to the shippers. And one of them might be a worker co-op. I mean, there's nothing to stop you from including a slug of money in whatever it is that the feds finally do to try and experiment and turn, you know, create an operator that's a worker co-op. It's how shall I say, it's a remote possibility in the US today, but miracles can happen.
Steve, I see your gears turning. Or I don't know what the train equivalent of that would be, but I'm going to use my executive power to call upon you. What are your thoughts?
No, it's not the whole issue of the public takeover of any part of the rail system is at this point, as both Martin and Jeffrey said, is far-fetched. It's a long way off. I think that the both the RW and the UE are trying to start that discussion and get both rail workers themselves and the public at large attuned to the issue and discussing it, raising it. So it's not as if we have to be concerned about who's going to run this system next week by any means, right? So I think that I was surprised by Martin's comment just now about you could have, you know, medium-sized companies that could still be profitable. I'm not interested in having any companies making a profit on this. big companies, small companies, medium sized, not, I don't think that profit making is in the interest of the public, the workforce, or shipping, or I don't really care that all that much about the shippers, frankly. So I think that the issue is what is showing that actually the pursuit of profits have led to a degradation of safety and of the system and maintenance, and that is in the interest of the workforce and the communities that that are served by the rails to have a system which is owned by the public and which is managed in the interest of providing the best service, not in the interest of making some level of profit for stockholders. So that I think that is the in terms of a socialist position on this, that traditionally the socialist position would be something like nationalization under workers' control, and we can discuss what workers' control means and the role that the community who are not workers, who are not present, who are not working for the railroads would play in that process and so forth. But there's a discussion to be had once those things are raised and become part of the atmosphere. And my only other point was before one of these meetings, I'm going to propose a drinking game where every time Martin says workers co-op, we have to take a drink.
That's actually I would say, and I would say this with all love and respect and true endearment, I guess, whatever the word is, for Martin, that would be a great way to make sure we had a national train system, because no one would be able to drive if we were all drinking that much.
Right.
I'd also say, just me personally, all of our demands are pretty far away from being realized. So I wouldn't let something like, well, this one is also far away from being, realized, let us shy away from making the demand or planting that flag in the first place. I see Jeffrey is on stack.
Yeah, I just wanted to add also I don't think profit's not really should not be the concern at all with this. And I would say that even if you have I think Martin was saying about four rail companies, private and one work co-op, I would say, I still think that there's a problem with cartels, which is just in economics, a cartel is a formal agreement between a group of producers. This would be the rail companies in questions, in which they come together to control the price of the goods and services, right? You would still just have a situation where profit maximization would still be the main goal here. And so nationalization, along with actual increased consciousness about the role of these industries and the need for regulation as a whole amongst the workers themselves and the public as well, is the way to go. So I think it's just the industry itself is just too it's just a natural monopoly. So it's just you can't increasing competition in any way is not going to be effective.
I'm sorry, the last thing you said, you
Oh,
can't.
I said increasing competition, right? If you expand the number of rail companies, or even they're they could be working co-op, but I guess I'm just more agnostic on that front than the other nationalization and the other education stuff I was talking about.
Okay. I mean, there's something to be said for a moderately competitive industry with a lot of medium-sized actors that gets you away from the cartel.
But how do you enforce mediumness? even if that was our North Star, how do you enforce that?
You would have to have antitrust included so that they didn't start gobbling each other up and get gigantic,
Jeremy, you're on stack.
which is hard because we here in the United States have weak economic regulation. We're not like, say, France.
Jeremy, you're on stack.
Yeah, I think Steve did a good job of like responding, which is that like that like competing firms like doesn't address the core issue, which is like like for-profit companies want to maximize the efficiency of every second and like exploit every second of labor out of the workers and all that. Like obviously as like they become monopolies, it's easy to do that, but I think like breaking them up a bit like doesn't get to the root of that the way like putting it under public ownership does, in my opinion.
I mean, that's the other debate about, as socialists, what do we think of state control of the economy? That takes us back to, I'm sorry, the book I was talking about, I think 2-3 weeks ago, Garo Perovitz, What Then Must We Do? Okay. I mean, the state ownership has been tried. There's a discussion to be had there. And if not state ownership, then what?
Any other comments, questions, concerns, thoughts, perspectives, etc.? Jeffrey, pro state ownership. Going once, going twice. About to go thrice. All right. I guess we can leave it, on an open-ended, hey, you, the listener, you listening on youtube.com to this discussion. What do you think then we must do? Let us know in the comments section. Yeah. We'll put #numtot in the description to drive traffic. All you people with your model trains, maybe you're a Lego person. What do you think about all this? I don't know. I don't know that much about trains. Maybe you know more. So let us know on the internet. Yeah. All right. Anyone want to close out? I guess I just did. All right.
Like
Thanks.
and subscribe.
Yeah, like and subscribe. What are you not doing liking and subscribing? You better not be driving while you're listening to this. If you are, you better have car audio on. And you better not be driving because Martin said we're co-op. That means having to take a shot. That means you're off the road, pal. So that's that. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
Well done.
Thank you.
How do we stop recording? Oh, like this.